Please welcome Jen Marlowe.
It is really wonderful to be here for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's really wonderful to see all of you here, and I know that this is maybe the first really beautiful day we've had in Seattle this year, so for folks to take themselves, I mean, I was almost thinking of not coming today, because there's sunshine, and of course, and people who know my travel schedule will laugh when I say this, but it's always very meaningful for me to be able to do events here in Seattle, since Seattle is my home, and I do consider it my home, even though I may only be here when you add it up 3 weeks out of the year. But it's just it is coming home and seeing so many old friends and so many supportive people out here today is kind of a testament to that. And of course, doing it here at Elliott Bay Books, which was, one of my first, we probably all had that moment, right, where we feel like we discovered Elliott Bay when we first came to Seattle or moved to Seattle. And, I remember walking in Pioneer Square and seeing this, amazing bookshop and falling in love with it. And so, there just is, I can't think of a better place to, that feels better for me to be able to share my work. And this is actually my first time in the new location, and I remember, as probably many people here, feeling so sad when I knew that the Pioneer Square location was closing, and then friends reassured me, like, well, the new location's actually pretty great. I think you'll feel okay, but I was sort of resisting because I was, I missed the Pioneer Square location, but they, of course, were right, because, you walk right in and it's still Elliott Bay, and it still is that, incredible place. So it's really great to be able to be here and to be able to share this work with all of you today. But it is with a little bit of mixed feelings. There's excitement, but there's some mixed feelings as well, because I'm standing up here alone rather than being with my co-author, Sammy Al-Jundi. And Sammy and I, when we first, very first started working on the book, our very earliest conversations about doing this book together absolutely involved this idea, with excitement that, when the book came out, we would have the chance to travel together, around the United States and talk to different communities. And that's, and once you read the book and kind of get to know Sammy a little bit, you'll understand how much that's a part of who he is, the opportunity to go and meet and talk with communities and share his ideas and his vision and hear from them their ideas and their vision. That's just an integral part to who he is, and that was an integral part of the whole plan for the book. The book being standing on its own feet, of course, but being a platform for those kinds of conversations to happen. Sammy is, until today, still waiting to hear about whether or not he is going to receive a visa to come to the U.S. He applied for the visa on March 30th, 2009.
Oh my God.
And at the time that he applied, it actually wasn't with the book tour in mind. At that time, it was actually to finish the book. We were still writing the book, and he was going to come, and we were going to spend the summer, in Chelan, some of it. I don't know if I told the people who are in the audience who had owned a condo in Chelan that was the plan. And of course, he's been waiting since then to hear about the visa. And, it's both mysterious and not mysterious as to why the visa has been delayed. He hasn't been rejected. It's just been in administrative processing, which, we know what that means. Sammy has received multiple visas to the U.S. in the past. He received a 5-year visa in 1999, and he received another 5-year visa in 2004. And so he's been to the States about a dozen times on those 2 visas, and every single time he had come to the States, it was always doing different peace-building projects. It was either in his capacity working with Israeli and Palestinian youth and bringing them together at a summer camp for dialogue-based reconciliation programs, or it was himself doing continued education at the Eastern Mennonite University's Summer Peace Building Institute. So it was always in his capacity as someone working towards peace and justice that he came to the States. So why he didn't get the visa this time is something that's not very clear to either of us. What the reasons were that he has not yet gotten the visa, that part's really clear. He did the visa application and then he was called in for a second interview, and that's the substance of that second interview was entirely about his security record, specifically about his 10 years in Israeli prison and about the action he had taken as an 18-year-old that landed him in prison. And so even though that action, and you'll hear more about what that was, but even though that action happened at the age of 18, even though he already spent 10 years in prison paying for that action, and even though in the 2 decades since he's been out of prison, his entire life's work has been dedicated towards nonviolence and peaceful reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, it was still the action that he took as an 18-year-old in 1980 that has caused his visa application to be now for over 2 years in administrative processing. So because Sammy is not next to me himself, I did think it was very important that that you got the chance to meet him, so to speak, and to hear his voice and his words and see him. So fortunately, there was a documentary film that was made a few years ago called Counterpoint. Counterpoint was made by Just Vision, and those are the same folks that made the film Boudreaux, which came to Seattle, I believe, at the end of November. So some folks might have seen it then. So their first film was Counterpoint, which was profiling about a half dozen Palestinian and Israeli peace activists, Sammy being one of them. So I would love to start off showing a clip. It's about 6 minutes long, but it's the section of the film that highlights Sammy, and you'll get a chance to hear him talk, just a little bit in his own words about his story, his history, his beliefs, and then of course, I'll talk more about the book and the process of writing it and read a few sections from it. So we'll watch a few minutes of Counterpoint featuring my dear colleague and my beloved friend and brother, Sammy Job. Of the work that Sammy did with Seeds of Peace, bringing Palestinian and Israeli youth together, and that's actually how I know Sammy. I worked with him in Jerusalem for 4 years, and in those 4 years, myself and my other American colleagues, Sammy and his family, basically made us honorary members of the Al-Jindi family. And Sammy was, when I said introduced him as my brother, I didn't say those words lightly. That is what the relationship was and continues to be. And my colleagues and I, we would spend just hours and hours and hours riding around with Sammy. He was driving a white Ford Transit in those days, picking kids up, bringing them to meetings, bringing them to each other's schools, to each other's homes. And as we were riding with him in the transit, we would hear bits and pieces of his life story. We would hear bits and pieces of his childhood, growing up one of 16 kids, 12 of whom who survived infancy. So one of 12 in the old city of Jerusalem to 2 blind parents. You saw from the clip that his mother's blind. Sammy's father is also blind. So some of the adventures that he and his siblings got into. We heard some of the stories that he mentioned a little bit in the film clip of his family's home being destroyed after the war in 1967, being forced out by Israeli soldiers who had newly occupied East Jerusalem. Bits and pieces of his parents' history. His mother, both his parents are from villages that were depopulated and destroyed in 1948, so both his parents are refugees from 48. His mother's from a village that was called Zachariah, which is now an Israeli moshav called Zachariah. And his father was from a village called Deir Yassin, which some people might have heard of, because Deir Yassin was the site of an infamous massacre on April 9th, 1948, where over 100 men, women, and children were massacred by 2 Jewish paramilitary groups. And his father was actually not in the village when the massacre happened. He was at a school in Ramallah for blind boys, but that's where his parents were from. So we would hear all these stories and hear the stories of prison, and like he talked about a little bit on the clip, the reading that he did. And every time we would hear just bits and pieces of it, we would always say, Sammy, you should write a book. And he would always respond very dismissively. He would say, oh, there's nothing to write about. My life's, there's nothing special about my life. It's just ordinary. It's just, regular. And he would he would always dismiss it. And then in 2006, I mean, Sammy and I both met with a very disappointing end to the organization we were working with, to Seeds of Peace. And in Sammy's case, I'd actually say that it was really a betrayal, what happened to him, and how he met his end with the organization. And he was in a very low place at that time. And I was trying to talk to him as often as I could just to give him support. And in one of those conversations, he said to me, this was towards the end of 2006, and he said, you know, Jen, that book that you and all the friends have been telling me that I should write, I think I'm ready now. I think I'd like to write it. And we talked about it for a few minutes, and, you know, I checked in about, you know, are you serious? Is this something that you really want to do? And he said it was, and I asked him if he would want me to come out to Jerusalem and work with him on it, and he said that he absolutely would want me to do that. So by the end of the conversation, we had planned that, you know, a month or two later that I would come out there and we would begin this process of him telling his life story. And at the time that I asked him if he wanted me to come, you know, I made that offer at the time because I thought that I was doing something for Sammy. I thought here was someone who I love deeply, who was in great pain, who had been, you know, horribly treated, humiliated, who is now in a situation where, you know, the very friends in his community who he had staunchly defended this peace organization to, and they were always telling him, oh, you know, what are you doing working for this peace organization? You were a freedom fighter, Sammy. Where's the peace? What are you doing working for peace? And he was, you know, staunchly defending them, and now frankly, they were laughing at him, you know, and saying, you know, basically, ha ha, we told you so. And you know, so when I said, Sammy, do you want me to come out there and work on this book with you, is because I wanted Sammy to be able to look people in the eyes, and when they said to him, what are you doing now, for him to be able to say proudly, well, I'm writing a book about my life. That's what I'm doing now. And so I thought that I was doing something for Sammy when I asked him if he wanted me to work with him on the book. Of course, what I couldn't have realized at that time was how much working on this book with Sammy would do, what that would do for me and what that would do to me. In many ways, living inside Sammy Algendi's head for 4 years has been an incredibly fascinating place to inhabit. And I very quickly became extremely passionate about this project for you know, entirely different reasons than the reason I first said, do you want me to come out to Jerusalem to work with you on that? And some of the reasons are actually in Sammy's initial answer when we would say to him, oh, Sammy, you should write a book. And he would say, and he said dismissively, oh, you know, there's nothing special about my story, you know, it's all very ordinary. And to some extent, that's actually really right. There's so much about Sammy's story, which is in many ways a quintessential Palestinian narrative. And I say a quintessential rather than the quintessential because, of course, you know, with any one of us individually, we contain multiple narratives. So, of course, any people contains, you know, many multiple narratives. But so many aspects of Sammy's life story really are a microcosm for, you know, a larger Palestinian, or a window into a larger Palestinian history. You know, from the fact that his parents' stories from 1948, Sammy's own story, his own earliest memories fleeing his home when the old city was being shelled in 1967, hiding in an underground bakery in the old city with 100 other people from the neighborhood, coming back to their home after the war, only then to be kicked out of it by Israeli soldiers in the following days because that neighborhood was being razed to be rebuilt for Israeli inhabitants. His own, you know, his politicization as a youth, growing up, witnessing more and more and experiencing more and more how the occupation was infringing on every aspect of his life. The choice that he and his friends made, that they thought that, you know, the only way to resist, the only way to fight for freedom for his people and to fight for dignity was through becoming a fighter. All of that, including the years that Sammy spent in prison. You know, an enormous percentage of men of Sammy's age and generation has spent some time in Israeli prison. Now, Sammy, having served 10 years is in some ways a badge of honor, in that this is, you know, but in those days, you know, if you marched in a demonstration and waved a Palestinian flag, that could land you 3 years in prison. in those days. So many aspects of Sammy's life are, a quintessential Palestinian narrative, but it's a narrative that's not well known at all in this country. It's a narrative that we don't have a lot of access to. We have a lot more access to the Israeli narrative. Our government is a very close ally with and friend of the Israeli government. That's the story that we've imbibed from our youth. And I mean, especially for me, growing up as a Jewish American, I grew up absolutely immersed in Holocaust stories, in as a little kid, pretending that I was Anne Frank, in reading, Leon Uris, The Exodus. And so I think it's especially true for Jewish Americans, but I think it's also true, for mainstream Americans, that those are the stories that made up our general consciousness of that part of the world. And it's only been, I think, very, very recently, within the last year or two, that Palestinian narratives have even been accessible to us, have even been presented to us. And of course, for any of us, and I hope this is true for all of us who care deeply about there being peace with justice and equality in Palestine and Israel, then there absolutely has to be a deep understanding of the Palestinian narrative. So for all those reasons, I became extremely excited and passionate about this project, and also because of who Sammy is. And given everything that he went through, the years in prison, having been interrogated and tortured before he was sentenced, everything he went through that led to him making the choice to become a fighter, and the fact that when he emerged from all of that his choice was a deep commitment to nonviolence, to working jointly, Palestinians and Israelis together, to cultivate a joint vision of, like I said before, peace with justice and equality. And Sammy is certainly not alone. There's many Palestinians that I know that work for nonviolence, with the idea of reconciliation. But one thing that I think is pretty incredible about how Sammy articulates that vision is not just the idea that, okay, listen, and I've heard this from Israelis and Palestinians, this idea of, listen, the other one is here, we can't do anything about it, I don't want to kill them, so let's figure out a way to live together in a way that's fair and equal to everyone. So the sort of like, we can't, we have to accept it, so let's make the best of it. But Sammy, the way Sammy has articulated it to me is not just let's make the best of a bad situation, but that actually that it could be a positive good, that the presence of each other and the relationship with each other, if it was predicated truly on equality, on equal rights, on each person's life and dignity being given equal value, that it actually could be an amazing thing, an amazing opportunity to create a society, to create a space unlike any other on the earth. So it's not just a sort of let's make the best of a bad situation for Sammy. For Sammy, it potentially could be a really incredible opportunity for something that obviously we're not seeing enacted on the ground right now. But he believes deeply and still believes deeply in that dream and in that goal, and that's one of many reasons why I think Sammy Al-Jundi is an extraordinary human being, and the combination of those two elements of his life being a window into a larger Palestinian story, and the incredible human being that he is, that combination I think makes this book incredibly important. And that being said, I actually would like to read a bit from the book, and rather than reading one section in depth, I've chosen a couple sections to read just a small amount from, because I wanted to give a sense of the journey and a sense of the progression of Sammy's life. So the first part that I want to read is actually from when Sammy is 5 years old. And it was just after the 1967 war ended, and Sammy and his family had just returned to their home. They left the bakery. He and his, at that point it wasn't yet 12 brothers and sisters, I think there were 5 of them at that point, with his mom and dad both blind, and they just got back to their home. The next morning, young Zuhair ran up to our room. Oh, sorry, I have to say one thing before I read that. Sammy, before the war started, Sammy was a 5-year-old kid. He knew that his whole world was within a 2-block radius from his home. And he knew that outside of the old city, there was this wall, which at that time separated Jerusalem. West Jerusalem was under Israeli control, East Jerusalem under Jordanian control. And he had heard, there was rumors that there was Jews on the other side of the wall. But that wall might have been, a million miles away as far as he was concerned, even though in reality it was probably 100 meters away. He didn't have any interest in those Jews on the other side of the wall until he began to hear these rumors that actually did begin to interest him, because the rumors that were flying around the kids in his neighborhood were that the Jews on the other side of that wall had tails, like cats. And Sammy kind of thought that was cool. He'd never seen anyone with a tail before, and he thought that might be an interesting thing to see. And so then the war began. They were in the bakery. They got back to their home. The next morning, young Zuhair ran up to our room. "The Jews are coming to count us," he announced. "They're 2 houses down right now." My mother was agitated. "Counting?" My father tried to calm her. "It will be okay. The fighting is over. Just answer the questions that they ask." We gathered in the courtyard when the Jews arrived. 2 of them were dressed in soldiers' uniforms. They entered our house. "What are they doing?" I whispered to my big brother Samir. "Probably looking for guns," Samir whispered back. One man remained with us in the courtyard. He was tall and was wearing khaki pants and shirt. He had a floppy hat with the brim. "How many people live in this house?" Floppy Hat asked my father in Arabic. "We are 2 families here," my father answered. Floppy Hat started with our family. "Name and birth date?" he asked my father, and then my mother. He jotted it down in his notebook. "Why are you writing all this?" my mother asked nervously. "So we can issue identity cards for you," he answered, as he began recording the names and ages of the children. As Floppy Hat was writing Samir's birth date, he turned to my father. "What is your son doing?" My father sensed immediately that I was not next to the rest of the family. "Sammy, get over here." I had been behind Floppy Hat, trying to examine his bottom. I crept back to my father, red-faced. "What were you doing?" Samir whispered to me. "I wanted to see his tail," I whispered back. "What did it look like?" "I don't know, I couldn't find it." When Floppy Hat turned around to count Abu Zuhair's family, Samir and I craned our necks, but we could see nothing resembling a tail. "Maybe he tucked it inside his pants," I whispered to Samir hopefully. "But then we would see some bulge," Samir pointed out. Perhaps there was something the matter with this Jew, I told myself. But when the soldiers came out of the house, we saw no sign of a tail on them either. I was bitterly disappointed. Years later, many years later, when Sammy had founded an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue group among peers, people his age in Jerusalem. He told this story, and an Israeli man about his age burst out in laughter because, according to this man who grew up around the same age as Sammy in West Jerusalem, right around the time that the war was going to start, they had heard the exact same rumors about the Arabs that lived on the other side of the wall. The next section that I want to read is, now we're skipping ahead 12 years, and Sammy is now 17 years old. And he had just dropped out of school. Although he was getting great marks, he was first in his class, and his family had these big hopes that he might become a doctor or an engineer. But he dropped out of school for 2 reasons, and one was his mother had been struck by a strange illness, and he knew that if he dropped out of school, he could work and help his family. And also, he and his friends at Boston Badawi had already made the decision that they were going to become fighters, and Sammy had already assumed that his future would end up with him either being killed or deported or in prison. And so he thought, well, what's the use of education if that's going to be my future? Now that I had dropped out of school, I needed work. Our neighbor Abu Ahmed had a job in a large Israeli factory making kitchen cabinets. They needed more workers. Abu Ahmed and I took an Egged bus to the factory to talk to the supervisor, Giora, about a job. The factory was in Givat Shaul. Givat Shaul had been built on the ruins of my father's village, Deir Yassin. Giora, a big blonde man with thick glasses and the knitted skull type typical to settlers, looked at me disdainfully, but hired me right away. My job was to deliver sections of cabinets to their next destination on the assembly line, shuttling back and forth with a small forklift. I also wrapped the finished cabinets in thick plastic, preparing them to be shipped to Europe. Giora barked orders and shouted at us, even at workers older than his father. The word Arab was added to whatever other adjective he slung at us, whether dirty or lazy. There was only one non-Arab working with us, an old, balding Iranian Jew named Rachamim. Rachamim was quiet, gentle, and a bit peculiar. He combed his thinning hair over his bald spot with a toothbrush. Giora did not spare Rachamim his abuse. Rachamim was Mizrahi, after all, only one step away from being Arab, and Mizrahi is a Hebrew term meaning Eastern, which refers to Jews of Middle Eastern or Arabic descent. More than hating Giora, I hated working in an Israeli factory located in Deir Yassin. "Where's your job, Sammy?" people in the old city would ask me. Deir Yassin, I had to tell them. Deir Yassin? Aren't you from Deir Yassin? I lowered my eyes and shrugged. My grandmother visited from Jordan. Tears sprung to her eyes when I told her where I worked. "Is your uncle Abu Ismail's house still there?" I did not know how to tell her that only a few buildings from the original Deir Yassin remained, and the Israelis had turned them into an insane asylum. My grandmother gripped my arm tightly before I left for work the next morning. "Sammy, please, bring me a fig." During my lunch break, I walked to the heart of Deir Yassin. I watched the crazy people wandering in the yard between the homes of my people. When no one was watching, I plucked a fig and a lemon from nearby trees. I gave them to my grandmother that evening. She held the lemon to her nose, breathing deeply the fragrance of her village. Then she cradled the fig to her cheek. "The figs in Deir Yassin," she said. "There are no figs in the world like those from Deir Yassin." The next day, I wrapped the cabinets, staring out the large window overlooking the valley covered in fruit trees. All the workers here were nothing but traitors, and I was the worst of them all. We were disrespecting the blood that had been spilled here. Maybe the souls of the massacred were still hovering in their demolished village. How could I possibly justify myself to them? Before wrapping the next cabinet in thick plastic, I carved words across its face with a screwdriver. I did it again the next day, and the next. The following week, I plugged the forklift backward into the charger, mixing the electric signals and blowing out its circuits. Each time shame overwhelmed me, I found some new way to sabotage the work. Abu Ahmed figured out what I was up to. "Sammy, you have to stop this. You're going to cause problems for all of us." I looked straight into Abu Ahmed's eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about." The manager began to receive phone calls from Europe about defective cabinets. It was obvious that I was the culprit. I was the only one with access to all the stages of the assembling. "You piece of rubbish, you disgusting Arab, I'm going to fire your ass. I'm calling the police," Giora shouted at me. "You want to call the police, you settler? Fine, call them, but you can't fire me because I quit." I stormed out of the factory and never returned. But I smiled each time I imagined customers in Belgium and Italy unwrapping their new kitchen cabinets, only to find the Arabic words I had carved deeply across their doors: "Made in Deir Yassin." Just a quick anecdote that highlights a little bit of the process of writing this book with Sammy. We had kind of a three-layered process, and the first stage was him just sort of dictating everything to me and me sitting and kind of writing it down word for word, and then I'd go back and rework it and identify, we called it holes that needed to be filled. And then the third stage after that was what we called adding spices. And there was, I would sort of highlight in yellow things that I wanted to come back to fill a hole in. And so the first version of this story that Sammy told me was, "And then I worked at a cabinet making factory, but I didn't like it very much, so I quit after a few months." So I highlighted that in yellow with a little note to myself, and a year and a half later said, "Okay, Sammy, can you say anything more? Why didn't you like that job?" Or, and then this incredible story came pouring out. And so It always makes me wonder how many other holes I might have missed. The next section I want to read is from when Sammy was in prison. And you heard him talk a little bit about the reading that he did in prison. And of course we know that political prisoners worldwide, using their time of incarceration to further their education, we know that that's not unique, of course, to Sammy or to Palestinians. And we know that Malcolm X famously taught himself to read and to write in prison. In Northern Ireland, the infamous prison of Longkesh is referred to as the University of Longkesh. Nelson Mandela got advanced degrees when he was on Robben Island. So that in and of itself is not unique, but what is pretty incredible was that it wasn't just Sammy as an individual making the choice to read and to educate himself, but that when he found himself in prison, he found himself immediately part of a community, a society of Palestinian political prisoners who were completely self-organized in a totally democratic system, and the prisoners themselves had developed this whole education system, as well as committees and internal ways to deal with every aspect of prison life. And Sammy found himself in a new prisoners course with a curriculum, again, all designed by the prisoners. And he ended up taking 4 levels of courses that were all structured with mixtures of, he'd be handed first a political book, and then when he, made his way through that, then he would be given the reward of literature or philosophy. And it was, the whole prison system was designed. Sammy talked about it being designed in a way where as he began to understand it, the older prisoners' primary task and responsibility was to build the humanity of the younger prisoners. Quite frankly, Sammy often talks about prison with a lot of nostalgia because although, of course, there was great suffering at being confined for 10 years, and yes, there was abuse and brutality that he experienced, and many very painful, hard times in prison, there was also, for most of those years, such a strong feeling of shared solidarity and shared spirituality between and among the prisoners, and that was a real source of nourishment and growth and inspiration for Sammy. And there was 2 waking hours a day that the prisoners did not spend either reading or sitting in a circle and discussing what they were reading. There was only 2 hours a day that they did not do that. 1 hour was the 1 hour a day that they went outside to the courtyard, the hour of sunlight. And that actually comes from a Mahmoud Darwish poem, which is quoted in the beginning of the book. We have on this earth what makes life worth living, and then he names all these things, the aroma of freshly baked bread, the hour of sunlight in prison, because you got the hour of sunlight. And the other hour was the 1 hour a day that the guards played over the loudspeaker an Kulthum song. Kulthum was a very famous Egyptian singer, and I say the hour that they played an Kulthum song because each of her songs were an hour long. I was homesick whenever I was sick or in pain. Our hour each evening with Kulthum had a similar effect. We sat in the cell listening to her voice emanate from the loudspeaker, each of us in our separate world. It was the one time of day we allowed ourselves to indulge in memories. I sat on my mat the entire hour, knees bent and arms wrapped around my legs, my head bowed down, closing myself off from my cellmates. I thought about my mother. She loved me more than anyone else in the world did, and by getting myself locked away in prison, I had broken her heart. As Kulthum's rich voice filled the prison and penetrated each prisoner's heart, I wondered whether my mom was thinking about me at that very moment, and whether she was crying. I cursed myself for the times I had shouted at her because I did not like the food she had prepared. I imagined her warm voice as she would caution me, "Sammy, you need to take care and be gentle and kind with other people." Words coming from her mouth always sounded like prayers. Before I left the house each morning, she would ask God to protect me and remove any bad person from my path. And then, pressing her hands against my cheeks, forehead, lips, and nose, she would make a copy of my face to store in her mind. She knew instantly by touching my face whether I was happy or angry or sad. She read my face like Braille. I felt the same soothing breeze listening to Kulthum as I felt when my mother read my face. To stop the approaching tears, I forced my thoughts to my classmates and friends. What did they look like now? What were they doing? Some of them might be in university, others married and starting families. What did they think of me? Did they see me as a hero? Or had I disappeared from their consciousness entirely? Kulthum made me yearn for the old city streets, my school, the market, my home, playing cards with Abbas and Badawi. Kulthum finished her song, and the guard shut off the loudspeaker. We sat for a moment in silence, then shook off our feelings and returned to our bunks. And the last section I want to read is now, again, quite a few years later. Sammy has been out of prison now for about 7 years. And he has met a young man, an American Jewish guy named Ned Lazarus, who had been a counselor at the Seeds of Peace camp in the U.S. and had come to Jerusalem in order to try to start a follow-up program so that when the kids got home, they would be able to continue the work they had started at camp. And Ned and Sammy had met at the Jerusalem Hotel at a mutual friend's birthday party, and basically in the beginning of the evening, they just started talking and, getting to know each other. And by the end of the evening, Ned had asked Sammy if he wanted to, help him drive around the country and picking kids up and bringing them to each other's homes and schools and meetings. And Sammy thought that sounded like an incredible, just fit incredibly well with his vision of the work that he wanted to do. And I think initially, probably for about the first 5 minutes of their relationship, Sammy was hired to be the driver for Seeds of Peace, and I think maybe it took 6 minutes, but Ned pretty much immediately recognized that Sammy was a partner, and that Sammy had a wealth of internal resources and just a wealth of so much, and that if that program was going to be successful, that the two of them needed to build it jointly, and that is what they, and that is how they operated, and that is what they did. And I want to read a section from that time, and I want to preface the section by saying, and I did this work with Sammy for many years, and I did it with my heart and soul. I have a lot of question marks. I have a lot of critique of dialogue-based joint Israeli-Palestinian work. And I want to make a distinction. I very much support joint Israeli-Palestinian work of a kind that is based on direct action. And we can get more into this if people want to in the discussion. But I have a lot of critique of work that how I describe that as sort of dialogue for the sake of dialogue. But that being said, I also, myself, and certainly Sammy as well, have witnessed a lot of really beautiful moments that have come out of that work. And even though I have a lot of critique of that work, and even though that's not the kind of work I choose to do or support right now, I would be being dishonest if I didn't acknowledge some of the really wonderful and beautiful moments that I've witnessed grow out of those kinds of encounters and those kinds of opportunities. So the passage that I want to read right now is one such moment for Sammy. Ned called me one afternoon. "You've met Yaron Avni from Ashkelon, right?" I had. Yaron was dark-haired, funny, and spit out words quicker than my brain could digest them. He invited us to his family's Passover Seder, tomorrow night. Are you up for it? I had never been inside an Israeli family's home. Until Seeds of Peace, the only Israelis I had known were left-wing peace activists like Muriel and Yoel. I looked forward to the opportunity to interact with a family from the heart of Israeli society. My wife Fadia was never happy when work was going to keep me away from her and the children, but she knew I was excited. My parents were happy as long as I was involved in anything that would not lead me to being hurt or imprisoned again. I did not mention to my brothers or sisters where I was going as I left the old city to pick up Ned. Yaron's parents welcomed us at the door of the small apartment and showed us in. There must have been 50 people crowded around the 12-foot-long table. They squeezed over to make room for us. I slid into a chair next to Ned and looked at all the faces. Your own siblings, cousins, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents. Your own grandparents were from Morocco and spoke Hebrew peppered with Arabic. 3 generations of Israelis at the same table. It reminded me of iftar meals at Ramadan with my entire family. Small booklets were passed around the table. It's a Haggadah, Ned told me. I flipped through mine. It looked like a children's book, telling the Pesach story with pictures and songs. I was surprised when Yaron's grandfather started chanting aloud from it. The booklets were not holiday souvenirs as I had assumed. They were part of an important ceremony connected to Jewish ritual. We tasted items on the table according to the instructions of the Haggadah. Matzah, bitter herbs. I tried to pay attention to everything. What foods we were supposed to eat and when. Why we were dipping hard-boiled eggs into bowls of salty water. I knew from the Quran that Moses and the Jews had been lost in Sinai, but hearing the Haggadah read aloud by Aaron's family gave me new details and a different perspective. It was difficult to hear the whole story because gossip, laughter, and conversation rose louder and louder. Nobody seemed to mind that Yaron's grandfather was still in the midst of chanting the Haggadah, and he certainly appeared undisturbed by the chatter of voices and the clatter of dishes being carried back and forth from the kitchen. The Moroccan-Israeli food was delicious. Yaron's father was a supporter of Likud, the largest right-wing Israeli political party. My conversation with him was intense, but it was passionate, open, and warm. Our voices were raised, but that was mostly because there was so much competing noise. Nobody took anything personally or got upset. There was no uncomfortable silence. In fact, there was no silence at all. At the end of the meal, Yaron's entire family sat with the Haggadah once again while banging on the table. They were wonderful. Yesterday, I had been in a West Jerusalem supermarket. When I answered my cell phone in Arabic, the other shoppers stared at me as if I were suspicious. The day before, a 19-year-old soldier had demanded to see my ID in a manner that communicated that he had the power and that I was barely tolerated. Those incidents did not connect to my emotions sitting around the Pesach table with multiple generations of Yaron's family. I felt safe, welcome, and wanted. I needed to bring as many Palestinian Seeds of Peace participants as possible to Israeli homes. If I had had this opportunity at their age, how different might the rest of my life have been? So I would love to open up the discussion and hear whether it is comments, questions, thoughts. I mean, I know there's people in this audience who have very deep relationships to Palestine, Israel themselves, and I'd love this to be not, it doesn't have to be just a Q&A. I think it can really be a discussion. Is that Ed in the back? Yeah.
Jen, thank you for those great readings. And yes, please, could you expand a little bit about your thoughts about reconciliation and focus on reconciliation and dialogue work, both the values and the limitations and drawbacks?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Like I said when I was sort of framing that thought, I want to reiterate it because I think it's a very important point. I very much am in support of joint Israeli-Palestinian work, and there's a lot of examples, incredibly courageous people doing incredibly courageous work, and the kind of work that I am very much am behind is work that is directly confronting the occupation and directly challenging it. And some examples of that are, if some folks saw the documentary film Budrus, which is highlighting, in one particular village, Budrus, where the wall was built. The Israelis have been building a wall that they term a security barrier. Palestinians term either a separation barrier or an apartheid wall, and the reality is that the wall is built deep within the West Bank, separating Palestinians from their own land, their farms, their schools, and it makes life egregiously hard for Palestinians in many places. And there's been, starting in Budrus and now all over the West Bank, popular committees that have developed where they've invited their Israeli colleagues, they've invited Israelis to come with them and to stand with them, demonstrating against the law, demonstrating against the military. And that's just one example of the kind of direct action, nonviolent work that is happening on the ground, Palestinians and Israelis jointly. Where I have a critique of of programs that, like I say, are sort of dialogue for the sake of dialogue is, they're predicated on this idea of humanizing the other. And of course, that's a positive thing. Of course, it's a positive thing for human beings to see each other exactly as that, human beings, and to develop relationship. But it sets up this notion that's going to be the way to solve the conflict, which of course then sets up the notion that the root of the conflict is based on hatred, and that if only that could be addressed, if only this problem of people hating each other could be solved, then the conflict would be solved through that. And I don't think that hatred is the root cause of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think hatred exists, and I think hatred is in many ways an outgrowth of the root cause. And the root causes, as I see them, is power and privilege and control. Who's got it? Which in this scenario, in this situation, is the Israelis. And so I think it boils down to what those who have the power and privilege are willing to do to maintain it, consolidate it, and expand it. Who doesn't have it, what they're willing to do to try to get access to it. I mean, I think that's, obviously in a very nutshell kind of way, what I see as the fundamental cause of the problem. So any of these sort of dialogue for the sake of dialogue programs that are rooted, predicated on this idea that hatred is the root cause, and that by humanizing you'll get rid of the hatred, just doesn't actually address what's really going on. But like I said, I've seen some wonderful, beautiful things happen, and I've seen a handful of Israeli youth be extremely radicalized by those programs, where they have heard from their friends on the other side about realities, or they've had the chance to see them with their own eyes, which they never would have had the opportunity to see otherwise, stories they never would have heard otherwise, and it did radicalize them to the point where they have been substantively working and resisting and fighting for change inside their own society. But I can also say that that's actually only a very small fraction of the Israeli youth that I know that have gone through those programs. I think a lot of the youth are changed individually. I think it has a profound impact on the individuals who participate in those programs. But how many of them are impacted in a way where they are prepared to dismantle the structures of power and privilege that privilege themselves? Actually, a very few. Now, those few are incredibly amazing and courageous, and maybe those few wouldn't be a part of that struggle if they hadn't gone through those kinds of programs. So it's I don't want to try to oversimplify it. There is complexity. There are outcomes that I've seen that I think are very important. But those so those are my, in short, those are my critiques, or some of my critiques. Yeah.
You implied that Seeds of Peace, which was praised a dozen years or so ago on 60 Minutes, may be doing something irregular. If you could clarify that, I'd appreciate it, because 1 week ago in 60 Minutes was an expose about Greg Mortenson's 3 Cups of Tea Foundation. It would be interesting to hear about Seeds of Peace.
I don't want to get in. It's sort of one of those big, huge, unwieldy, ugly stories. I don't want to spend too much time getting into the details of it. I will tell you that it is all exposed in chapter 13. But in short, what I can say is that there's so many different dynamics. There's dynamics of the role that the Israeli government ended up playing in Seeds of Peace, which was supposed to be, a non-governmental organization, unaffiliated, but ended up, being very influenced by the agenda of the Israeli government. That's one element of it. And there's also other elements of, and this is true, I think, of a lot of NGOs that have these really inspiring mission statements, but when you look at actually how they get down to functioning themselves, like in Seeds of Peace case, the whole mission is about tolerance and respect and dialogue and humanity, and yet in terms of, how the internal dysfunction of the organization works and how staff is treated and things like that is in many ways the direct opposite of what the mission of the organization is. And Seeds of Peace certainly is not alone in that. So it was a confluence of many sort of forces that came together at once. Those are just sort of, that's a quick answer with a couple examples. I will say that I don't have any official contact with the organization now. I don't, everything that's revealed in the book is very true. I think it absolutely shows an underbelly of Seeds of Peace. I can't speak to which of those trends still exist, what things might have been addressed by the organization since then. That I can't speak to. But there were absolutely some very problematic aspects of the NGO itself. In addition to dialogue work in general of this particular NGO, and it's exposed in as far as the things that really impacted Sammy and the things that that were really troubling to Sammy. Yeah.
Hi. I have a comment. I'd like to hear if you agree with it or not. And a question. Quickly, the comment is, I share your critique of the dialogue groups. And I've just put it a little differently. Sometimes I've said, my critique is that the precondition for these dialogue organizations is that you have to come to it basically accepting there's two realities and they're of equal value and are equally valid, and the reality of the oppressor and the reality of the oppressed are not equal. So that's my critique of a lot of the dialogue groups. So I'd like to hear if you agree or not with my critique. My question is, Sammy mentioned Nelson Mandela early on, and one of the big reasons for success of the South African movement was the divestment and sanctions campaign, which is starting to pick up on Palestine. Excuse me. So my question is, what is Sammy's position on that, and how, in relation to the fact that he works in an organization that's more focused on dialogue, can you be pro boycott, divestment, sanctions, and do this kind of work, or are they kind of mutually exclusive?
Just a point of clarification, Sammy no longer hasn't worked with Seeds of Peace since 2006. But so first to comment on your comment, and then to address your question. I think generally I absolutely agree with your comment. I think that's another one of the critiques I have is this idea, and working for an organization, we were always told that we had to be neutral, right? That our job was to be neutral, to bring these kids together. But when the situation itself is imbalanced and you're trying to portray it as balanced, then you're actually skewing the reality. And that was one of the things that I struggled with when I was working with this organization. In terms of the BDS, Sammy and I've only had BDS is the acronym for boycott, divestment, sanctions, which like you mentioned was a huge part of the international campaign that ended apartheid in South Africa, and is a growing, burgeoning movement in Palestinian activism. And just for folks who doesn't know the history very briefly, the call was put out in 2005 by a large network of organizations that made up a large swath of Palestinian civil society, asking for support from the international community to engage in boycott, divestment, sanctions, sort of following the South Africa model until Israel complied with international law. And there's sort of three basic demands to BDS, and one is a full end to occupation, and the other is the right of all refugees to return, and the third is that Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, be treated with full equality as Jewish Israelis. That's sort of obviously it's spelled out in more detail than my thumbnail of it. And I've only actually had one brief conversation with Sammy about BDS, and I think he sort of had two different responses, which were both really genuine and both really strong, and also kind of opposite of each other, in the sense that on the one hand, he in one sense has a vision that is almost saying that by going 180 degrees opposite of the BDS campaign, it would actually be even more revolutionary. That if the entire Arab world were to have, to say unconditionally, fully normalized relations with Israel, and make that offer, sort of almost in the lines of like what the 2002 Saudi peace plan was, but even beyond that, then it would be clear to the whole world who, that, and his prediction was that Israel would not accept that offer. Israel would, but then it would be completely clear to the whole world sort of who was reaching out their hand and who was barricading themselves in a corner. but that the approach, that in some ways that the approach should be mirroring the image of the world that he was trying to create. So there was that was one response, and then the other response was like boycott and divestment and sanctions. I mean, those have historically been a very, very important non-violent tools in so many different, and yes, in apartheid, but also in, like the Palestine, in the first Intifada was largely non-violent and largely built on a program of strikes and boycotts, and so there is a part of him that is very excited by that movement as an international way to engage non-violently in the conflict, and then there's a part of him, so human beings are complex, so there's different, different responses. And again, I can't speak for Sammy, of course. If he was here, he could answer that much more directly. In terms of whether I think I don't think there's a contradiction in doing dialogue work and endorsing BDS. I think a lot of the organizations that do dialogue work would say that there's a contradiction, but I think that's maybe coming out of other agendas. I don't think that there's inherently a contradiction in that.
What is Sammy doing now?
Sammy, actually, I just got an email from him yesterday. He actually had gotten a call from the U.S. consulate, which shows that there may be some possibility of that the visa process might be moving along. But Sammy right now is, I wish I could say that he's involved in work in which he's using all of his human potential and intellectual potential, but it's a really hard situation. He doesn't really want to work for one of the other kind of big peace NGOs, not only because what happened in Seeds of Peace left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he began to feel like he sort of looked at a bunch of other organizations and began to feel that a lot of them in many ways were sort of only beautifying the face of the occupation, in a sense, and he began to really be a lot more critical of a lot of those organizations, and his security record makes it very difficult for him to get any job with an Israeli. I mean, he got, there was 2 or 3 different times where he got a job, and then 10 days later or 2 weeks later, he was told, thank you, his services were no longer needed. Whatever is the window of time needed for there to be a security check was the window of time that he held the job, and now he's working as a cashier in a 24-hour bakery, and he works 7 days a week, 9 hours a day, and he's holding on to kind of a thread of hope to to an hour of sunlight, and he's still trying in his way. He's a poet, he's still writing poetry. He's engaged in with Al Hakawati Theater and discussions with literature, and he's still he's trying to find ways to plug into work that feels right and feels good to him, but it's still his story and his life in many ways is still unresolved. I mean, I think hopefully all of us are still on journeys, but yeah, much like the situation there is certainly not resolved. Sammy's own life is also very much unresolved. Yeah.
I'd like to bring it back to the book because I've read it, and I just want to say that I think it's one of the best books I've ever read. It's just amazing. You did a marvelous job between you and Sammy working together. I think it's very informative. It's poignant. There are times when I laughed, as we did from your readings there with the tale. Cried for all the different reasons one cries. I just want to say, for anybody who's wondering about whether they should buy the book, do so. It's really good.
Thank you. Your check will be coming in the mail. You should expect it next week. Okay, I want to be sensitive to people's time and also the fact that there is another event here this evening. So we'll take 2 more questions, and I want to make a couple wrapping up comments, and then of course I will be happy to talk one-on-one. When you, of course, buy books and bring them to be signed. So I hope that, even though that, we'll only have a few more questions, I hope that this will just be the start of the discussion. But so there'll be 1 and 2 for the 2 more. Yeah, so 1 and 2, and then I'll make a few kind of wrappy-uppy comments.
My question is about the political prisoners' self-organization. Do the Israeli authorities tolerate it on purpose? Is it something they just can't break up, or is it something that they tolerate for some reason?
It's a combination of all of the above. I mean, before Sammy got to prison, he entered prison. Well, he was arrested in 1980. There was a year and a half of his trial period where he was in a different prison system. So he was a part of the real political prison system starting in 1981. And in the late 70s, early 80s, the Palestinian political prisoners have had a series of revolts and hunger strikes and other kinds of resistance actions, which were earning some of the hard-won privileges that Sammy benefited from. So earning the privileges to have notebooks and pens and books and things like that. And when Sammy was in prison, and this is all, of course, described in the book, I mean, he also participated in hunger strikes and other acts of resistance to try to change their conditions. But also, Sammy described in many ways, a very symbiotic relationship between prisoners and guards, and that in many ways, as long as the prisoners weren't, bothering the guards were content not to bother the prisoners. And he talked about how when there was acts of resistance, and the prisoners were going to be harshly punished and going to be beaten and tear gassed and things like that, often it wasn't the guards who did that. Outside soldiers were called in to beat the prisoners. Why? Because the guards would have to be with the prisoners the next day. After whatever had caused the disturbance had calmed down, the guards would still be with the prisoners. So they often brought in, outside soldiers for to enact some of the harshest punishments. So I think there was a combination of all those factors. Yes, Anna. I could not agree with you more, and I've done work in many areas of the world where, the whole war in the former Yugoslavia, was packaged to us as, ancient ethnic hatreds. So often, either things are presented as hatred, or it's like, oh, it's a religious fight, or it's a tribal fight, and of course, in so many of these conflicts, I think there are religious elements, or there's a level of that. But much more often, I think it boils down to the same thing I said before. Power and control and privilege, and who has it and who wants it, and then all these other things are often exploited. Religious sentiments, tribal identities, things are often exploited, both by people who are trying to sort of lobby the support of their people, and then also, of course, by the media as this overly simplistic way to give us our news in this little, bite-sized nugget of information that we can find easily digestible rather than actually analyzing the structural issues going on. So, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it's absolutely true in the case of Palestine, Israel, and of course, all over the world. So I want to make a few quick kind of announcements and then conclude. On the table back there you will find a few different things. You'll find copies of my documentary films, which include Darfur Diaries and Rebuilding Hope, and then a short documentary that I completed recently called One Family in Gaza. Those are all for sale for any folks who would like them. You would buy those separately. You buy those from me, not from the bookstore. There's also two documentary films, which were not ones that I made, but I'm connected to. One is copies of Encounter Point, which you saw a clip of featuring Sammy, and it features the stories of about 6 other grassroots Palestinian and Israeli peace activists. And there's also I have copies of Arnest Children. And I work with a group called the Friends of the Jenin Freedom Theater. And Arnest Children was a film made by Giuliano Mer Khamis. And some of you might have been following the story of what happened to Giuliano. I don't want to take too much time to talk about it now, but Giuliano had made the film Arnest Children about him and his mother's work in Jenin refugee camp during the first Intifada. And Giuliano's mother was an Israeli Jewish woman named Arna. His father was a Palestinian Christian Arab from Nazareth, from inside Israel. And Giuliano's mother, Arna, had become, later in her life, an ardent anti-occupation activist and made the choice to go to Jenin camp and start an art program with the kids there. And Giuliano accompanied her and did theater work with the kids, and they did incredible work together, which is then documented in this film, Arna's Children. And Giuliano ended up, was an actor, got involved in his own career. His mother died of cancer. He didn't go back to Jenin camp for many years until in 2002, during the height of the Second Intifada. There was massive invasion of Jenin refugee camp. Large swaths of the camp were bulldozed. I was there like 2 weeks after that. I remember walking on football fields of rubble of what used to be people's homes, and Giuliano went back to Jenin camp at that time to answer the question, what happened to these children that he and his mother had worked with, what happened to Arna's children. And what he found out was that most of them were dead. And some of them had died as resistance fighters, resisting the tanks that were invading Jenin camp. One had launched a suicide attack in Hadera, Israel, killing 4 women and injuring 30 others. And actually one who was still alive when Giuliano returned to the camp actually died during the course of the filming. He was killed in resisting the daily incursions by the army. And Giuliano made this film, Arna's Children, that tells all that story, and in many ways is really a searing and devastating portrayal of how occupation kills childhood. And after he made the film, he just intended to make the film, and then he realized he couldn't just make the film and then just sort of go on with his acting career. That if he's going to make a film, he does it with the idea of trying to at least have some impact on reality. And he decided to go back to Jenin camp to live there himself and to rebuild the theater that he and his mother had built together that had gotten destroyed in 2002. And he did that, and it was called the Freedom Theater. And Giuliano lived in Jenin camp from 2006, when the Freedom Theater opened his doors, until April 4th, 2011, when Giuliano was shot 5 times in the head right outside the Freedom Theater by a masked